Good evening, everyone. This is Natalie Ellis with ESTEEM Counseling and Consulting Services, and today's Wednesday, Ask the Therapist. So today our topic is going to be about healthy boundaries. Last week we talked about steps to get to emotional healing, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about healthy boundaries. Okay, so I'll give people a few minutes to come in. But in the meantime, this topic came about. I participated in a Facebook Live a few weeks ago, and this was the topic that was being talked about with this particular individual about ways to maintain healthy boundaries. Because that seems to be an ongoing issue or concern that people have. And with a lot of my clients, and I talk about my clients a lot because, again, these are things that I'm finding in my practice with a lot of my clients. And with a lot of my clients, boundaries, maintaining healthy boundaries is something that they struggle with. And so it's important that we have conversations about that and talk about different ways to gain healthy boundaries and to maintain healthy boundaries. And so I want to talk about that, okay? So it's about, I guess, 8:05, 8:06, so I'll get started. So boundary, we'll talk about a definition of boundary first. Boundary is anything that marks a limit, an imaginary wall, or a barrier that keeps us feeling safe, comfortable, and protected. Okay? Again, boundary is anything that marks a limit, an imaginary wall, or barrier that keeps us feeling safe, comfortable, and protected. Okay? Boundary can be anything you want to keep private or personal. And so we're going to speak about personal boundaries. Okay? Boundary can be a thing, a place, a thought, a feeling, one's individual body, one's room, personal belonging, experiences. Okay, so under personal boundaries, when we talk about that, there's three things to be considerate of. Our physical boundary, which is our body, is a physical boundary. Our space can be our physical boundary. The things that we have, our objects, our personal belongings, can be physical boundary in terms of our physical things that can be seen. And with that too, with physical boundary, there's also touch. So people can be inside of our space, but they're not necessarily touching us, right? And so another piece to physical boundary is when people touch us without our permission. And that could bring some discomfort, and that could be a violation of our space, of our body as well. So touch is a form of a boundary. And then we have emotional boundary, which speaks again to our emotions, our feelings, and people may step into our boundary when they hurt our feelings, when they do things to undermine our feelings, and when they dismiss our feelings, not pay attention to how we feel and things of that sort. So those are ways emotional boundary can be is a form of emotional boundary. Okay? And then we also have mental boundaries. And so emotional speaks on the feelings, physical speaks on physical things, including our body and touch, and mental speaks to our thoughts and opinions. And so, again, with our thoughts and opinions, people, that could be violated too. So boundary. So we have, again, all these things are ways that mark a limit for us, whether it's an imaginary limit or barrier. And in our thoughts, in our physical space, in our feelings, there's things that we do to keep us safe, comfortable, and protected, right? And in that, we want things around us that's within those boundaries around us that's going to be safe, comfortable, and keep us protected. Okay. And so when we think of boundaries, there's different types, and Nina Brown coined 4 different types of boundaries. Soft boundary, which is when something is soft, there's really like, in the ways that she describes it, those people have no kind of boundaries, right? So they're easily offended in terms of their emotion, and they may easily offend others in terms of boundaries with others as well. When people have poor boundaries, or when we're discussing boundaries, it's how we're treated, because our boundaries impacts relationships, right? It's not just in terms of how people interact with us, but also how we then interact with others, right? So when someone has soft boundaries, it's allowing people um, to get into their boundary easily, soft, and also vice versa in terms of how they relate to others. They could easily also break people's boundaries as well. So for them, people with soft boundaries are easily broken for them. Trust is a form of boundary. When we say we're going to do something, and whether we do it or not, when certain boundaries are broken, then emotionally and also mentally, stuff is broken, right? Rigid boundaries is when there's a wall there, right? And so for people with rigid boundaries, they don't let people into their space. They don't let anybody into their emotions in terms of how they feel. They may not share a lot of things in terms of their thinking. So in terms of their mental boundaries, they may not share. They may not talk about different things. They may not share opinions. So people with rigid boundaries tend to be closed off physically in terms of their space, but also emotionally and mentally as well. And then we have, she coined spongy and flexible. And spongy and flexible are similar in that flexible boundaries is based on the situation. So it's important to look at the situation and determine, should I have a soft boundary in regards to the situation, or should I have a rigid boundary in regards to the situation? And again, these are ways in terms of how do we gain healthy boundaries. It's being able to recognize flexibility and being able to look at situations and assess what is needed in those situations. Okay, so we've talked about physical boundary, emotional boundary, as well as mental boundaries, and in those different forms of boundaries, we have soft versus rigid, and then in between we have flexible types of boundaries. Again, boundaries are healthy ways and intentional ways to protect ourselves from emotional harm, okay, and from physical harm as well, right? And so there's a boundary with the stove. We know that if we touch it, it's going to hurt. So there's some boundaries that we put in place in terms of that. There's boundaries we put in place in terms of our emotions and the walls we build if we let people in, and what will that do? So again, recognizing what all we allow in that space and whether or not it brings harm or brings safety, comfortability, or protection to us. Okay? And boundaries is something that begins very, very early on, right? And so in a lot of the work that I do with clients, I talk a lot about our upbringing, because our upbringing shapes a lot of who we are. And so being able to be aware of our experiences during our childhood, good, bad, or indifferent. And so I talk a lot about adverse childhood experiences, which are the negative things that we experience in our childhood, and how they impact our emotional health, mental health, physical health, and all those things. Okay? And so adverse childhood experiences can be from mild to severe. So people experience adverse experiences in their upbringing and throughout their life, some mild and some severe, and that impacts in a lot of different ways. Okay? So, with that, what are some steps we can take when we're recognizing that people are constantly violating our boundary? So when we're noticing that people are violating our boundary, whether it's through coming into our space without our permission, whether it's dismissing our thoughts, or whether it's emotionally saying things to hurt our feelings. So when we're noticing that people are consistently violating our boundary, it's important that we recognize that and do things about that. And so what are some things? First, it's important to recognize what all is in your space. So one of the things I talk a lot about with clients is kind of imagine this circle, right? And inside of this circle, here you are. There's this dot, and you're inside of this circle. Well, this circle, when we think of boundary, imagine this circle is your space, your mental space, your physical space, your emotional space, all of that. And inside of this space is what we're talking about in terms of this wall, right? There's a wall around that space, and inside of everything inside of this space with us should bring us safety, comfort, right? Protection, right? And so part of what happens with individuals is when I tell them to do this, and we start identifying what all is inside of their space, mental space, emotional space, personal space, physical space, all those type of things. They start to identify and notice things that brings them harm, emotional harm, pain, hurt, whether it's people, right? Whether it's situations, whether it's thinking patterns, right? Right? Because again, not only do we sometimes allow people to get into our space, but we also allow ourselves to get into that space. We violate our own boundaries sometimes. We say things to hurt ourselves. We cause harm to ourselves too, right? And so sometimes the things that we say to ourselves creates harm. And so it's important to kind of look at what else inside of this space. And so another way I talk about it is imagine you have a house, right? And everything is inside of this house with you, right? When people are coming in, or when you're meeting people out in the street and you get to know them, they get to know where you live, because again, these are different forms of boundaries. Not just everybody gets to come to your house, right? Not just everybody gets to, even when they know your house, not everybody gets to come to the kitchen. Not everybody gets to come upstairs or in the bedroom area, right? Your bedroom is your most intimate space. Not everybody get to go there. But again, in terms of the boundaries too, when our boundaries are violated and broken, it's like people coming into your room without any permission. Right? And so it's important to look at what all is inside this room that's not supposed to be there. Right? So mentally, physically, emotionally. And so that's the first step. So identifying what is all in your space, emotionally, physically, mentally, that's creating harm. Right? So that's the first step. And the second step would be to be honest and direct with your needs and your wants to yourself and to others, right? And so the other thing that gets to happen is once I have clients identify what all is inside of this space with them that's creating harm, whether it's people, whether it's situations, whether it's jobs, whatever those things are, right? So it's a boundary when we allow our job to come into our home, when we're going to bed and we're still thinking about work. These are different forms of emotional boundaries that's not okay, right? And so when we're noticing those type of things, that's starting to create distress because they're now part of your most intimate space, right? How do we set those? So we're now trying to set those boundaries. And so part of that again is being honest with recognizing what's in there. It's about figuring out what you need. And so with individuals, they have to be able to identify and say, I need to get this out of this space. And sometimes it's about being really direct with individuals, right? Oftentimes people who are pleasers, for example, right? People who tend to please, in some ways their boundaries gets broken all the time, right? Because they have a hard time saying no. So people don't have a problem interrupting them, don't have a problem inconveniencing them because they say no and they're constantly saying yes. They have a hard time saying no. And when that starts to happen, then people tend to use us. People tend to, again, not care for our thoughts, not care for what we think, not care about what we want, right? And so, again, how do we begin to set some boundaries in regards to that? All right? So, again, being honest and direct with your needs and teaching others how to do that. But first we have to know how to do that. What is it that we need to keep us safe and protected inside of our boundary? Okay? And when there's anyone or anything or situations that's not bringing peace to us, or that's creating not just any kind of discomfort, but that's creating harm and distress, then it's about figuring out, okay, maybe they need to be in other circles. And so then the other thing I talk about with clients is creating multiple layers. I don't know if you guys can see this, but creating multiple layers. Okay? And so Because again, when we're creating multiple layers, it's about, you know what, there's things inside of this space, because again, this is my most intimate personal space that's causing harm. I need to learn how to place them elsewhere. And again, sometimes there's things we just need to get rid of. Situations, people, right? Thoughts. There's things we just need to get rid of altogether. To get out of our space, mental space, physical space, emotional space, all the way. We need to get it out. But there's things that's part of our life, and we can't just get rid of it. However, we have to learn how to set a barrier, set some limits. Okay, so when we talk about boundaries, we are talking about setting limits, and so we have to figure out what those limits are and what do they need to look like. But again, in order to do that, we have to do some self-reflection, right? We have to recognize when people are have violated our space, when they've just kind of walked through our door without our permission, right? And we have to recognize that. And part of that is learning how to say no. So the next step is learning how to say no, which is a lot about learning how to set limits, learning how to set boundaries. Okay? Healthy boundaries is about setting limits. Okay? And so that's the third thing. And then the other thing I tell clients too, and we're noticing again a lot of stuff inside of here that's consistently creating harm, sometimes again going to therapy, processing it with a therapist. Because again, a lot of things in our past, they don't just go away. So in order for us to develop new tools, we first have to process some of the hurt, some of the pain, some of the things that's happened, in order for us to utilize and process and utilize and practice the tools and skills that we need to do in order to maintain boundaries, right? And so with that, an example, let's talk about parent-child boundaries, right? And so and we're going to talk about it more so parent-child, adult-child, parent. So oftentimes I have a lot of clients who are adults and who are in situations where they have parents who consistently come into their space, come into this space without permission, says whatever they want to them, and do whatever they want to them in some ways. And again, under the premise, you're my child. You know, I'm your parent, and not taking into account this is now an adult, right? And so these behaviors, obviously, like I tell a lot of my clients, are behaviors that's happened for a very long time, right? So this is just the ongoing patterns and behaviors, and so it's not an easy pattern to break. So it takes practice, it takes processing, and it's going to take a lot of work to change some of those thinking patterns and things of that sort with the individual, and also behavior patterns with the individual. Okay, and going back to adverse experiences too, with a lot of my clients who have abandonment issues, issues with not being accepted by parents, and so a lot of those relationships impacts further relationships, right? So one thing I talk a lot about is our first relationship is the one that we have with our moms and dads. Whether we have it or not, it's a relationship that's there. Even in the absence of it, something is formed, some form of relationship has occurred, right? Even in that absence. But the long-lasting relationship that we continue to have is the one that we have with ourselves, right? And so the foundation is laid with that relationship with our parent, and then we just continue those patterns that's been laid with our parents to the rest of the relationships that we continue to have. And so it's important to pay attention to what those relationships are, and what those patterns are. And a lot of times boundary issues begin really early on from childhood. And so these are not patterns, behavioral patterns, thinking patterns, emotional patterns that just goes away. It takes work. So processing these things with a therapist is the fourth thing that I would say. And developing healthy coping mechanisms. Again, with developing healthy coping mechanisms is recognizing ways to set limits, right? And so when we work on being mindful, and again, a lot of my work with clients is about becoming more intentional and more mindful with how they think and how they feel and what's going on with them. And so, for example, I have a client who some of her boundary issues is the need to please and seeking approval. She's because of again, her relationship with her mother. There was always a need to seek approval with her mom. That's something she continues on with all her other relationships. And so she was at work one time, and there was this lady who, something happened with the lady, and the first thing in her mind is, oh, let me go do something nice for this lady. Right? She doesn't really know the lady all that well, but if she felt bad in her mind, that she felt bad about something, and she needed to overcompensate, and here she was. And so again, these are different forms of emotional boundaries, whereas she was going to feel as if she needed to overcompensate for something and do something more than what needed to be done, because nothing else was needed to be done. And so she caught herself. Why do I need to do this for this individual? Why do I feel I need to do this? And so again, part of it went back to, oh, okay, because when I felt bad about something that happened between me and somebody, these are the things that I would do. And so again, the parts of the healthy coping mechanisms is to become more mindful, taking a moment to begin to pay attention to our behavior patterns, our thinking patterns, our emotional patterns, and all of that. Okay, so these are just some basic things in regards to healthy boundaries. Again, if people have more questions about it, I definitely encourage people to seek counseling. Go to a local counselor. Put your zip code in Google, and local counselor's name will come up. And definitely start doing the work, because the thing about boundaries, when you got a lot in here, right? When everything has kind of there's no limit, and everything is coming inside of this space, it becomes very hard for you to maneuver after a while. And it becomes really hard to move and do things. And so, as one of my clients eloquently told me, she lost herself inside of this space. She no longer had a space of her own, because everything else and everybody else was inside of that space. Or everything else in terms of stuff at work, stuff with her families, just everything was inside of that. And she no longer had her own space anymore, which created a lot of distress. And which created physical health issues, right? And again, mental health and physical health go hand in hand, okay? So, again, we talk about boundaries, anything that makes a limit, an imaginary wall or barrier that keeps us feeling safe, comfortable, and protected. We talked about 3 different types of boundaries in terms of physical boundary, emotional boundary, and mental boundary, and how those boundaries can be soft, meaning it's easy for things to get in there, or rigid, where it's very hard for things to get in there, or flexible, whereas we assess situation. We assess whether or not we're going to let things in or out based on the situation. Okay? So these are different forms of boundaries. And I think that's it. So if anybody has further questions for me, please contact me through my, if you're doing it through Instagram, I have LinkedIn, I have Facebook. You could definitely email me. Again, my name is Natalie Ellis. I am a licensed professional counselor in the state of Georgia, out in Decatur, Georgia area. And we were talking about ways to maintain healthy boundaries. Hopefully this was a bit helpful. And hope to see you next week. All right, on Ask the Therapist, and definitely follow my page. And I put all these things, Ask the Therapist, on my YouTube channel, so you could look up other topics that I've talked about in the past, all in the YouTube channel. Okay, under Natalie Ellis. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.